The sound of glass was everywhere. Not shattering, just clinking, touching, whispering against itself. That's what I noticed first when I stepped into the ballroom, the way everything glittered too perfectly, as if the entire place were built from mirrors that didn't know how to stop reflecting. I stood at the entrance for a few seconds, unsure whether I had really come here of my own will. The air smelled of champagne, lilies, and polished silver. Every step echoed like a confession I hadn't meant to make. It had been 10 years since I last saw this house. 10 years since I decided I would never come back. Yet here I was again, standing beneath the same chandelier that used to make me dizzy as a child. It looked heavier now, older, as though it carried the weight of every lie told beneath it. A woman in black sat behind the reception table, her hair tied into a sleek bun. She looked up, searching for my name on a list, then handed me a small card with a practiced smile. Ariella Paul the Outsider. The letters were gold and thin, printed beneath the family crest, 2 lions holding a crown. I stared at it for too long, hoping I had read it wrong. But the words didn't move. They just sat there, cold and permanent, like a joke no one would ever explain. Behind me, someone laughed, a laugh I recognized immediately, light and sweet and cruel in the same breath. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Verana's laughter had the kind of tone that wrapped itself around every room she entered. Even after all these years, it still found me easily. I placed the name card back on the silver tray and straightened up, smoothing the wrinkle on my dress. The motion was small, but it felt like armor. I wasn't going to give her, or anyone else here, the reaction they wanted. A waiter brushed past me, carrying a tray of champagne. I took a glass, mostly because it gave my hand something to do. The bubbles hissed quietly, rising and dying before reaching the surface, just like all the things I'd once tried to say. Around me, people laughed, kissed cheeks, exchanged compliments that sounded like rehearsed lines. They were all dressed in silver and gold, a walking mosaic of money and taste. Not one of them looked at me long enough to remember I shared the same last name. I caught a glimpse of him then, my father, standing in the center of the room. Arthur Paul, the man who built this world and forgot who he'd built it for. He was surrounded by people, all leaning in, eager for a word, a touch, a piece of his approval. He looked taller than I remembered, his hair grayer, his posture straighter. His laugh was steady, controlled, every gesture polished to perfection. For a second, I wondered if he would look up. And then he did. Our eyes met from across the room. His smile didn't falter, but it didn't change either. He raised his glass, not to me but through me, and turned away to greet someone else. That was all it took to remember exactly why I'd left. A small voice inside me said I shouldn't have come. Another voice, quieter but sharper, replied, "No, you needed to." The sound of music swelled. A piano, smooth and elegant. I moved further into the crowd, careful not to touch anyone. Their perfumes blended into a dizzying cloud. The chandeliers flickered slightly, scattering light like shattered water across my face. Someone behind me whispered, "Is that her?" The word her slid through the air like a blade. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I had spent half my life being her, the missing piece in a perfect picture, the one who didn't fit the frame. I reached for another sip of champagne, pretending to enjoy it when a voice appeared at my side. "You came." It was Verana. Her tone was honeyed, but there was steel beneath it. She wore a silk gown the color of moonlight, her makeup flawless, her pearls deliberate. Even her shadow seemed to know where to stand. "It's been years," she said, smiling. "You look mature." "I suppose time does that," I answered. Her gaze swept over me the way one might appraise a stranger's purchase. "Arthur didn't expect you tonight. You know how busy he's been. I wasn't sure you'd want to come." "I didn't," I said, sipping again. "But I'm here." She laughed softly, tapping her glass against mine. The sound was small, but it carried. "That's what matters, isn't it? Family." The word tasted sour even from her mouth. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would leave a scar deep enough for her to feel it, but I didn't. That wasn't why I was here. The lights dimmed slightly. A man's voice came through the speakers, announcing the beginning of the evening's speeches. I moved toward the far wall, far enough to watch without being seen. Verana glided toward the stage, all grace and silver smiles. My father followed, placing a hand around her waist with the same affection he'd never had for me. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer began, "please raise your glasses for Mr. Arthur Paul." Applause thundered through the room, and I stood still, the only person not clapping. My father took the microphone, smiling the way powerful men do when they're surrounded by people who owe them favors. He thanked his business partners, his friends, his wife. He called her the heart of the family. He never mentioned my name. I watched him gesture toward Elise and Julian, Verana's children, his chosen heirs. The spotlight touched their perfect faces as they waved to the crowd. Elise, radiant in gold, and Julian, proud in his father's tailored suit. They were everything he had ever wanted me to be, and I was everything he had learned to forget. I realized I hadn't taken a full breath in minutes. The air here was too smooth, too practiced. It carried the weight of old perfume and expensive lies. I turned toward the edge of the room, away from the stage, and caught my reflection in one of the glass walls. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. I looked calm, composed, like I belonged here, but my eyes told the truth they always did. They still carried the same defiance I'd had the night I walked out of this house with a single suitcase and a promise never to look back. Now I was back, and the promise had started to tremble. A ripple of applause rolled through the room as my father finished his speech. He lifted his glass high, his voice confident and warm. "To family," he said. The crowd repeated it in perfect unison, as if the word itself had been rehearsed. Family. It hung in the air like perfume, sweet, suffocating, false. I watched Verena lean her head against his shoulder, her hand brushing the cuff of his sleeve as though sealing a claim. Elise and Julian beamed beside them, the spotlight catching the glint of their smiles. For a brief second, I felt like an intruder in a photograph that would never include me. I turned away, toward the long glass windows at the far end of the hall. Beyond them, the garden shimmered under strands of white lights. I could almost hear the faint hum of the fountain outside, the same one I used to sit beside as a child, counting the ripples and pretending each one carried a wish. Back then, I always wished for the same thing, that he'd look at me the way he looked at them. A waiter approached, polite and nervous. "Would you like a refill, miss?" I nodded. The glass tilted as he poured, golden liquid catching the light. My reflection stared back at me from the surface, older, sharper, quieter. The music changed. Slow jazz now, soft enough to drown in. Couples began to drift toward the dance floor. I noticed how Verena moved first, guiding my father by the arm. He followed her effortlessly, smiling as if it were second nature. They looked synchronized, almost choreographed. Watching them felt like watching a play I had already seen too many times. Someone brushed past me, Elise. Her perfume hit first, then her voice, silky and bright. "Ariella," she said, feigning surprise. "You made it after all." I smiled politely. "It seems I did." Her grin widened. "You look successful. Freelancing, was it?" "Yes." "Good for you," she said, and I could hear the space between the words. It was the same tone her mother used when complimenting a waiter for remembering her order. "I'm surprised you came," she continued. "Mother said you preferred distance." "I still do," I replied, "but some things are better seen than remembered." She blinked, uncertain whether it was an insult. Then she laughed, short and brittle, before excusing herself. I watched her join a group of friends, all sparkling in their practiced laughter. Their world had always been a mirror maze of compliments. The lights dimmed again. Another announcement. This time it was Julian, his voice through the microphone, charming, confident. "I'd like to make a toast to my father," he said, "a man who taught us that family is built on loyalty and honor." He gestured to the crowd, soaking in their attention. "And to my stepmother, whose grace keeps us all grounded." Laughter. Applause. My jaw tightened, but I stayed still. Julian went on, a speech about legacy, reputation, success. Not one word about honesty. Not one about love. And that was when it hit me, how every toast in this family had always been a eulogy for the truth. I felt the familiar ache rise in my chest, the same one I used to feel at 13, sitting alone at the dining table after everyone had left, scraping cold food into the bin while they laughed upstairs. I used to think I could earn my way back to their warmth if I just worked harder, smiled wider, spoke softer. But the truth was simpler. There had never been a place for me in their story. The sound of the piano drew me out of the memory. I found myself staring at my father again. He looked older, yes, but not weaker. The lines on his face weren't from guilt. They were from time well spent on everything except me. He met my eyes across the room. There was something unreadable there, perhaps surprise, perhaps annoyance. I gave him a polite nod, the kind you'd offer a stranger on the street. He turned away first. He always did. I needed air. The hallway outside the ballroom was quiet, dimmer, almost kind. My heels clicked softly against the marble as I walked, passing portraits of ancestors whose eyes followed me through the shadows. Near the staircase, I found the old mirror that used to hang by the front door. It was still there, still cracked along the corner, a flaw Verena had always meant to fix but never did. I stared at my reflection. The crack ran straight across my face, splitting my image in two. For a moment I saw both versions of myself, the girl who used to wait and the woman who finally stopped. A voice came from behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I turned. My father stood at the end of the corridor, his hand still on the doorframe. His expression was neutral, but his tone carried an old irritation, like a tune he never stopped humming. "I was invited," I said. He exhaled. "Verena thought it would be good for the family." I smiled faintly. "Always thinking of what's good for the family." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You could have at least tried to be civil. It's my birthday, Ariella. I've been nothing but civil. You didn't clap. I didn't know I was supposed to." For a second, silence stretched between us, fragile as glass. His eyes flicked toward the ballroom, then back to me. "You still haven't learned how to let things go." I laughed softly. "Oh, I let go a long time ago. That's why I'm standing here instead of pretending to belong in there." He frowned. "Always so dramatic. Always so blind," I replied before I could stop myself. Something flickered across his face, anger maybe, or just recognition. But he didn't argue. He simply straightened his jacket and said, "Try not to ruin the evening." And then he walked away. I stood there, watching his reflection disappear into the corridor until only my own remained. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I took out my phone, unlocked it, and scrolled through an old photo, my mother and I in front of this same house. She was laughing, sunlight spilling into her hair, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. She had written something on the back of that photo once. "One day, you'll outgrow the walls they build around you." Maybe that day had come. I slid the phone back into my clutch, wiped the condensation from my glass, and walked toward the ballroom again. The music had changed once more, louder now, grander, as if the house itself refused silence. As I entered, the light from the chandelier struck the rim of my glass, scattering tiny beams across the floor. They shimmered briefly before fading, like sparks from a match too small to last. But one of those sparks lingered just long enough to touch the silver ring on my finger, a simple, elegant band I never took off. Its reflection caught my eye, and for the first time that night, I smiled. Not because of what was happening, but because of what was coming. The chandelier hummed. Not a real sound, of course, but a vibration in the air that I felt along my skin, like static before a storm. Music climbed the walls and melted into the ceiling. Voices drifted through the light like silk. I moved along the edge of the room, where shadows gathered in cool pools beneath the columns, and watched the party behave the way expensive parties do. Effortless smiles. Careful laughter. Secrets with perfect posture. Verena found me again. I knew she would. People like her never leave threads unfinished. She appeared with the grace of a swan and the focus of a surgeon. In one hand she carried a crystal flute, in the other a small clutch that matched her dress with suspicious precision. "You slipped away," she said, tone bright. "Arthur thought you were upset." "I was in the corridor," I answered. "The house remembers me better than its owners do." She laughed with just the right amount of warmth. "You always did have a sense of theater." I let my gaze rest on the chandelier for a beat. "Theater is what this house does best." Her eyes flicked to my glass. "Still sipping the same champagne? Let me have the waiter bring the Blanc de Blancs. You used to like it." The remark floated down and landed with a small thud. There had been a time when I liked nothing here. Not the drinks, not the summer house, not the winters full of perfect white silence that never thawed. The only thing I had loved had been a garden bench under the old linden tree where the wind made soft vowels and the birds spoke in tiny silver consonants. I had told my mother I could live on that bench. She had kissed my hair and said I could live anywhere. Then she left me a year later for a place where even the wind could not follow. "I do not need anything," I said. "Of course you do," Verena replied, voice low and intimate, as if we shared a private foolishness. "You always needed things you never knew how to ask for." A string quartet began a new piece. The first violin did not quite settle on the note, and for a second the whole room felt human. Then the intonation corrected itself and the evening floated again. Verena touched my arm, a gesture that looked gentle from across the room. "Walk with me." She led me toward the gallery that overlooked the dance floor, up a shallow stair, past portraits that wore powdered hair and long faces. We stopped beneath a wide arch where the light softened into a dusk made of gold. From here the ballroom looked like a painting, everyone arranged by color and price and ambition, a world my father understood better than he understood me. "One day," Verena said, "you will thank me for teaching you how to stand apart without looking lonely." "I am not lonely," I said. "No," she agreed, and the approval in her voice felt like a bruise. "You learned. I can see it even in the way you hold your glass. You used to clutch, now you balance, such progress." "Is this the part where you congratulate me for becoming a person you can tolerate?" I asked. "Or the part where you remind me I will never be one of you?" She smiled with her mouth, not her eyes. "I never said you could not belong, you chose to leave." I let the sentence sit between us. 10 years of distance compressed into one breath. Chosen. The word was too elegant for what happened. People like Verena love the word choice. They tie it around your neck like a ribbon and call it a gift. Down below, my father danced. He still had that measured rhythm that looked like confidence and felt like chore. He did not look up once. He did not have to. The room looked up for him. You took the college fund, I said, almost conversational. You convinced him to. You told him Julian needed it more. Verena did not look at me. Julian needed a start. So did I. You had a different kind of start. Yes, I said. A bus station at midnight. She turned then. The light traced her cheekbones with careful respect. You survived. That is what matters. Survival is not the same as being loved. Her gaze did not waver. Love is not a currency I waste on adolescents who confuse defiance with depth. I felt a familiar heat rise and pass through me without finding a place to burn. 10 years ago it would have found fire. Tonight it found nothing to hold. Tell me something honest, I said. When you printed the name cards, did you run out of titles? Daughter felt too expensive, so you chose outsider, a thrifted word for an old wound. It was a joke, she said softly. Everything cruel here is a joke. She faced the ballroom again, one hand resting on the rail with the poise of a dancer. This family requires performance, Ariella. We dress our truths. We press our corners. We make difficult choices for a larger picture. That is not cruelty. That is design. Design is what you call a lie when it pays. For a moment she was very still, then she leaned closer. Her perfume was winter white and expensive. I wonder why you came, she said. To judge, to seek permission, to show your father you no longer need him. He knew that the day you left. I came, I said, to see how small this world looks when you are standing outside of it. She almost laughed, almost. We will always be the house that made you, she said. Do not forget that when you make your case to yourself. I was about to answer when the quartet paused and a new voice boomed through the speakers. Julian again. His words rose in polite waves. I could not make them out from here, but the pattern was familiar. Gratitude, legacy, reputation. Words that children learn when love arrives attached to a ledger. In the pause that followed, something shifted. Not in the room, in me, a slow realignment. As if the house had tilted by a single degree and all the glass had agreed not to scream. Verena said, "Come, your father wants a family photograph." "Without me," I said, and did not ask it like a question. Her smile warmed. "Do not make a scene." I set my glass on the rail, then changed my mind and took it with me. A girl in a midnight dress passed with a tray of sugared almonds. Verena lifted one with surgical precision and let it melt on her tongue as we walked. We reached the staging area beside the dais. An assistant in a headset fluttered around the family like a nervous sparrow. Elise checked her hair in the black screen of her phone. Julian fastened a cufflink that probably cost more than my first year of rent. My father stood at the center, straight as a column carved from the idea of heritage. The photographer adjusted his lens. Mrs. Paul to the left. Elise a touch forward. Yes. Mr. Paul, chin slightly down. Perfect. His eyes found me. "And you are?" he asked, pen hovering. Verena answered before I could. "She is fine off frame." The photographer nodded without curiosity. The headset girls smiled at me with kindness that hurt. I stepped back under the pretense of giving them space. The truth was simpler. I did not want my outline inside that rectangle. The flash popped. Once, twice. The room applauded the image it could not yet see. I watched the white squares bloom on the camera display. Family as proof, family as commodity. Family as design. I turned away and found the service corridor that ran behind the stage. It smelled like citrus and steam. The light was lower here, more honest. A dishwasher hummed like a good secret. I stood very still and let the quiet wrap around me like a coat. Footsteps clicked toward me, not hurried, intentional. "You do have a talent for hiding," Verena said, stepping into the corridor with the slow pleasure of a cat that always finds the warmest surface. "Not hiding," I said, breathing. She studied the industrial sink, the rows of stacked plates, the steel lamps. "I understand why you left," she said, with a softness so sudden I almost missed it. "What I do not understand is why you seem determined to keep leaving even after you have arrived." I looked at her. "Because arriving implies I want a seat." Her gaze dropped to my hand, to the simple band of silver there. "Pretty ring," she said. "Old," I replied. "From her?" she asked, and the pronoun landed like a feather. My mother belonged in this corridor more than she belonged in the ballroom. She used to sneak us down to the staff kitchen during long parties and feed me spoonfuls of lemon custard until we laughed ourselves sick. She would give me the spoon and tell me to keep it for luck. I had kept nothing. This ring was mine, not hers, and yet the question curled around a place in me that would always answer to her name. I bought it myself, I said. Verena nodded once. Independence looks good on you. Approval looks strange on you, I said. She did not flinch. I am not your enemy, Ariella. I am the wall you learned to lean against until you could stand without it. I did not lean, I broke my shoulder hitting it. Either way, she said almost kindly, you stand. A silence opened, not awkward, wide. I could hear the party breathe through the vents. The quartet began another piece. I recognized the melody and could not name it. Arthur worries, she said. Worries about the reputation of his last name. He worries about you more than you understand. He understands me less than I deserve. She studied my face with something like curiosity, as if I were a painting she had finally decided to see. Will you stay for cake? She asked. Maybe, I said. She smiled, real this time. Good, it is lemon. She turned to go, then paused as if she had remembered an item at the end of a list. By the way, she said lightly, the foundation audit is next week. There is a small misunderstanding with one of the partner accounts. You may hear whispers. Ignore them. People love a rumor when they cannot afford the truth. I watched her leave. The perfume faded, and in its place the corridor kept the smell of citrus and steam and something clean that had no price. The words she had chosen kept their shape in the air. Foundation. Audit. Partner accounts. A small misunderstanding. I was not sure which detail mattered, only that they had been placed in the sentence like tiles in a floor that expected to be walked on without question. Back in the ballroom, someone called my name through a microphone. Polite. Controlled. The sound did not reach the corridor fully. It came to me as a softened bell, as if the house wanted to keep me for itself a little longer. I pressed my palm to the cool steel of the counter and let my thoughts settle like flour in a jar. Then I slid the silver ring half a circle along my finger and felt the faintest click. No one in that room would have heard it. I barely heard it myself. The smallest movement, the smallest sound, enough to remind me that what I carried was not an ornament. I walked back into the light. The quartet swelled. The chandelier hummed. The photographer raised his voice for a new arrangement. The guests turned in the synchronized dance of polite attention. I found a place near the back where the glass on the far wall reflected the whole room inside a second room that did not need approval to exist. Elise spotted me and lifted her hand in a wave that was both friendly and triumphant. I answered with a nod. Julian launched into another toast, this one shorter, as if he had learned the exact length of praise the room could digest without reaching for water. My father rested one palm on the dais and moved his gaze across his audience with the slow ownership of a painter signing a canvas. The hum inside my chest matched the chandelier now. Not nervous. Ready. A server passed with a tray of lemon cake shaped into white squares and trimmed with candied peel. I took one. The first bite tasted like the corridor. Steam and citrus. The second tasted like a memory that had never been given permission to age. Another spotlight lifted and widened across the stage. I followed its growth until it spilled over Verena, turned her into a statue of light, and gilded the corners of her smile. I swallowed the last of the cake and then the last of what I had once called doubt. When the applause faded, I set my empty plate on the nearest tray. My hands were steady. The silver ring was cool again. I watched the stage and waited for the next breath of the room. The evening had finally learned the shape of my name. The ballroom had changed when I returned. Maybe the lights had shifted, maybe the people had loosened into their second glasses, or maybe it was just me seeing it now for what it was, a performance. Every face was an act, every smile a rehearsed cue. My father stood in the center of it all, surrounded by half-drunk admiration. Verena at his side looked almost ethereal, the silver of her gown melting into the light. The two of them fit together perfectly, like a painting that had never needed retouching. I lingered near the bar. The pianist had moved on to a slower tune, something that pretended to be romantic. The marble floor gleamed, smooth enough to reflect the ceiling like a lake. I imagined the chandelier falling, just once shattering the reflection and freeing everyone from their illusions. A voice broke through my thoughts. Enjoying the view, Julian, my stepbrother. He stood beside me, tall, confident, wearing the same expensive smirk he'd practiced since we were teenagers. His tie was slightly loosened, rebellion perfectly measured. I didn't expect you to remember me, I said. He laughed. Hard to forget the legend of the runaway sister. Legend? Come on, he said. You walked out at 18 with a suitcase and a speech about independence. Even Verena quoted you for weeks. You were her favorite cautionary tale. I raised my glass, glad to be of service. Julian leaned closer, lowering his voice. You shouldn't take it personally, you know? Mother's always been pragmatic. Pragmatic, I repeated. Is that what she calls theft these days? He blinked, then smiled, smooth again. You mean the scholarship thing? That money was just sitting there and I had better grades. Father thought. I know what he thought, I cut in quietly. He thought you were worth investing in. Julian tilted his head, studying me. You turned out fine. You even started a company, right? See, everyone wins. I almost laughed. The way he said it like fairness was a math problem. Not everyone. He shrugged. Maybe not everyone works as hard as they claim. Before I could answer, Verina's voice floated through the hall. Ariella, come join us for a toast. Her smile reached me long before she did. Julian grinned and moved away. Break a leg, he said over his shoulder. I followed Verina toward the dais, the hem of my dress brushing against marble like a whisper I couldn't take back. The crowd gathered again, obedient as tide. My father took the microphone once more. Before we end this evening, he said, I'd like to acknowledge those who make this family what it is. Verina, whose grace keeps us grounded. Elise and Julian, who represent the next generation of excellence. Applause thundered. He looked right over me as if I were smoke. Then Verina added lightly, and of course we're happy to welcome Ariella back among us tonight. It takes courage to come home. The applause that followed was thinner, polite. I smiled as if I couldn't tell the difference. Courage. That word tasted like dust. I felt the chandelier's warmth above me, its crystals bending light into fragments that painted the air across my face. Somewhere in that shimmer, I remembered being small, standing in the same room during another of my father's parties, holding my mother's hand and asking why everyone smiled so loudly. She'd whispered, because silence is too honest for them, darling. I didn't realize then how much truth could cost. Verina stepped closer, whispering between her teeth while she clapped. Smile wider, dear, they're watching. I did, and beneath that smile I whispered back, they always have been. The crowd began to disperse, drawn back to their laughter and their drinks. Verina kept her composure, but I saw her eyes flick toward the far corner of the hall where two men in dark suits whispered by the wine table. Their badges caught the light just once. Not guests, accountants maybe, or auditors. The same word she had mentioned earlier. Foundation, audit, misunderstanding. A thread tightened in my chest. Elise floated past, cheeks flushed with champagne. You should dance, Ariella. Everyone's talking about how calm you look. It's unnerving. I'll take that as a compliment. She laughed and vanished into the crowd. I watched her spin under the chandelier light, her gown catching sparks from every direction. For a second I saw what Verina wanted the world to see, a perfect daughter, a perfect family, perfection as currency. Then I looked down at the ring on my finger, its small surface glinting like a promise waiting for the right moment. I stepped closer to the bar, pretending to set down my glass. My reflection in the mirrored shelves looked almost detached, someone else's calm face. Beneath the surface, my thoughts moved with a new precision. The corridor, Verina's words, the audit. The rumor she feared before it existed. The truth was already here. It only needed a light bright enough to make it visible. A hush rolled across the room as the piano faltered. My father stood again, clearing his throat. Before we end the night, he said, a small announcement. The Paul Foundation will be expanding its reach this year. New partners, new donors. We are proud to set an example for ethical leadership. Ethical leadership. Something inside me laughed, soundless. I felt the vibration of my phone inside my clutch. One buzz, then another. A notification flashed briefly across the screen before I locked it again. File transfer completed. No one noticed. Not yet. The chandelier hummed louder, or maybe it was my heartbeat, steady and electric. Verina caught my eye from across the room, her expression too calm to be comfortable. She raised her glass slightly. I mirrored the gesture. For the first time all night, the room felt perfectly balanced, like the brief stillness before thunder. The pianist began again, the notes falling like gentle rain over marble. People resumed their chatter, their laughter, their illusions. I smiled, tasting lemon on the air from the slices of cake still being served. The night moved on as though nothing had shifted, but I knew better. Because somewhere behind the walls of this house, truth had already started to echo. And when glass begins to hum, it's only a matter of time before it breaks. The stage lights came up one notch, a quiet flare that turned everyone's faces into soft masks. The pianist slowed to a hush, and the chatter in the ballroom folded in on itself like fabric being drawn through a ring. I could feel the house taking a breath, gathering itself for a moment it believed belonged to it. My father moved toward the dais with the ease of a man arriving at his natural height. A small team trailed behind him, the event manager with her clipboard, the photographer with his smile turned to low, a technician wearing a headset, and the permanent apology of someone who keeps the world from burning down with tape and timing. Verena was already there, one hand on the rail, the other resting near the microphone as if the night might ask for permission before borrowing her voice. I stood at the back of the hall, inside a neat column of shadow. From here I could see the room as if it were a stage set, the planes of glass and marble arranged like scenery, the people arranged like props that had learned to move. My reflection in the tall mirror to my left hovered beside me, a second Ariella, quieter, patient, watching the first for any sign of weakness. A screen descended with theatrical grace from the far wall. The technician gave a small thumbs up. People turned expectantly, that collective tilt of heads that happens when an audience and a machine make a pact to behave for a few minutes. The Paul crest bloomed on the screen in clean gold lines. Applause rose because the crest knew how to ask for it. My father lifted the microphone. His voice struck the air with that same tempered warmth, a key he had always held. He thanked the guests for their loyalty, the partners for their faith, the city for its history of excellence that had allowed men like him to carve out a corner and call it legacy. He spoke about the foundation in phrases that sounded like marble plaques, about ethics as one speaks about weather in summer, confident it will hold. I let the vowels of his sentences pass over me without landing. They were smooth and well-fed, a language of abundance that never had to learn to beg. I watched his lips shape words I had once waited to hear at a kitchen table. Pride, daughter, home, none of them appeared, not even by accident. He was careful. He always had been careful. He had taught me the edges of carefulness from the angriest lessons. The slideshow began. Photographs of charity galas and ribbon cuttings and scholarships awarded to faces that smiled gratefully for the shape of a future that would never quite match the brochure. Verena appeared in many of them, a figure of light in gowns that whispered when she walked, her hand placed just above the elbow of a donor, her head tilted at just the angle that made generosity look like a crown she wore lightly. I felt my phone pulse in the clutch, a single hum against my palm, like the smallest heart knocking. I did not look. I already knew what it would say when I wanted it to say it. The next series of images drifted across the screen, a montage of what the foundation called stories. A student stepping into a sun-slashed library, a medical grant presentation under a tent on a rain-bright morning, a new wing of a community center with a plaque that caught the light like an obedient miracle. The room softened into satisfied approval. The applause arrived exactly where it was expected. I glanced at the ring on my finger. The silver caught a sliver of chandelier light and sent it back into the room as a single bright seam. I turned the ring a fraction. There was almost no sound. A click small as the memory of a door closing a decade ago. Julian came up beside my father with his practiced smile and offered a few words about continuity and forward vision, about systems and safeguards that would allow the foundation to scale its compassion. He had learned to speak in the dictionary that made money feel like a moral. People clinked their glasses in polite agreement. Somewhere near the front, a woman dabbed at the corner of her eye the way one does when she wants to be seen being moved. I breathed in and out until the rhythm matched the slow metronome of the chandelier. Calm is not the absence of anger. It is anger that has learned a posture. Verena stepped to the microphone as the final slide of the montage dissolved into an image of the Paul crest over a grain field at sunset. She thanked the partners by name, a litany of surnames that sounded like buildings. She turned to the screen with a smile that invited the room to witness a home movie of benevolence. Her voice lowered, that intimate register she used when she wanted people to imagine they were in her kitchen, being folded into a confidence. "There is one more surprise this evening," she said. "A short tribute to the heart of what we do, the stories that remind us why we are here." The lights edged darker, not dim yet, just enough to push the colors in the room toward richer versions of themselves. On the screen, the crest faded. For a second there was only a wash of white, the projector adjusting its breath. And then a dashboard appeared, not ours. A spreadsheet grid, clean and clinical as an operating table. Columns labeled with dates and sums. Vendor names that did not belong to the programs they were supposed to nourish. Transfer notes that spoke in neutral accounting words about movements that were anything but neutral. The image sharpened. A cursor moved as if a hand somewhere were guiding it now, selecting a row, expanding a cell. The amount inside the cell looked ordinary until your eyes flinched and understood the comma. 6 figures that knew how to keep secrets. The name at the end of the transfer. A company that shared a bloodline with Elise. The room did not understand it at first. Several people leaned forward in the way city dwellers do when the train stops between stations. The technician froze in the narrow space between the screen and the rack of quiet equipment, headset tilted, waiting for the universe to tell him whether to stop the noise or let it speak. Verena's smile did not falter. Not yet. There was a moment when the world always thinks the wrong slide has arrived, that somewhere a button had been tapped out of order. She moved toward the mic, graceful, aiming to smooth the air with a story about a technical hiccup that would charm the crowd back into their chairs. Before she reached it, the next image filled the screen. An email thread, names blacked out except for the ones that mattered. A subject line about reclassification for discretion, an attachment listed as revised ledger. A final line from a sender with an address the Foundation had used for internal corridors. We will move the rest before audit. Silence learned a new shape. It grew thicker. It fit every mouth. I did not move. The ring on my finger rested where I had turned it. The phone in my clutch slept like a satisfied animal. Near the bar, a glass clicked too loudly against a bottle. The pianist took his hands off the keys as if the instrument had become a live wire. My father's face had not changed yet. He was still in the room where applause was the only weather. He stepped forward into the light and said, "There seems to be an error." The word error sounded like it had been cooked too quickly. The screen changed again, a scan of a signed authorization. The signature was not a stranger's. People looked at Verena and then looked away with the speed of trained discretion, as if their eyes had broken a rule. She held to her posture the way a dancer holds to a story after a misstep. She reached the microphone and said, "Thank you for your patience." Then she said another sentence she could not finish, because the video that arrived next did not let her. It was the corridor behind the stage. I recognized the lamp with its dented shade, the industrial sink that had kept my hand cool not 20 minutes ago. I recognized Verena's voice before her face came into frame. "Transfer the funds before midnight. No one will trace it back to the Foundation." Someone in the third row whispered an apology to no one and set his glass down on the carpet. It did not break. It made the smallest chime, a bell calling a service the room did not request. I watched my father listen to the voice of the life he had married. His eyes did not find me. I was not the line he needed. He reached for the technician with his gaze, the way powerful men reach for the lever that fixes their stage. The technician looked at him with the honesty of a person who can no longer pretend to understand what electricity wants. The screen split, a neat dual frame. On the left, the bank statement. On the right, the corridor video. The totals and the voice agreed with each other. 2 small sentences appearing at the bottom like captions in a language everyone understood. "This is what you are seeing, and this is why it cannot be denied." It would have been very easy to step forward then, to lift my chin and deliver the kind of speech people remember when they drink. I could have said the word justice as if it were a gift I was giving them. I could have told the story of a girl at a bus station with a suitcase and the price of a one-way ticket to the life she built with her own hands. I did not. I breathed and let my silence become a table no one could move. Elise made a sound like a piano string releasing. She looked at her mother and then at the screen and then at her mother again, and something tender and terrified ran across her face because she had learned to be beautiful before she had learned to be safe. Julian stood very straight, his mouth a line he was trying to draw into authority. He failed because authority requires ground and the floor had turned to water. My father lifted his hand, palm out, the old gesture from my childhood that meant enough. For a second I was 11, holding my breath in a hallway, listening to voices become hammers in the dining room. Then I was here again, in a ballroom that had dressed itself in gold to keep from admitting it was made of glass. Arthur said, "Stop this. Whoever is responsible will be removed." His voice was not warm now. It had hardened into a weapon he had used for years on the wrong wars. The screen faded to white. The technician exhaled like a man rescued from a dream. The lights began to climb back toward their comfortable levels. Conversations tried to remember how to begin themselves. Verena lifted her glass with a hand so steady I almost admired the engineering of her nerves. And in that brief interval where the room believed the worst had slipped behind a curtain, my phone pulsed again. Transfer complete. I felt the message settle into me like a key sliding into a lock that had been waiting behind the ribs. I let my thumb tap the screen inside the clutch once. Nothing more. The gesture was small enough to be mistaken for a heartbeat. There was no announcement. There was no music cue. just a slow alteration in the room's air. The way summer sometimes remembers it is not a promise. People began looking at one another not for approval now, but for instruction. The kind of glances that ask what is the rule when the rule leaves. Verena found her words first. "Thank you all for understanding," she said. "A small disturbance, a technical misplacement. We will review this privately. Please enjoy the evening." The cake is a sound cut her off. Not the pianist, not a microphone. A phone, somewhere near the front, vibrating against a glass tabletop. Then another. Then a third, their sounds arriving like birds discovering a wire. I did not need to look. I knew where the alerts were going. Not to the phones of this room, not yet. To other rooms. Offices lit too brightly after hours. Inboxes that measure consequences in quiet increments. Places where the word audit is not a rumor and the word ethics sits with its back straight. The screen lifted itself back into the ceiling. The crest returned on the small banner above the dais as if it could replace what everyone had seen with a promise. The chandelier let down a slow rain of light to remind the room how to sparkle. The quartet found a gracious melody that asked nothing of anyone but attention. I tasted lemon again, sharp and clean at the back of my throat, and realized I had put my tongue to the memory of the cake as if it were an oath. My father set the microphone down. He did it carefully, like a man setting down a loaded object he no longer trusts. He looked toward the back of the hall then, eyes scanning the dark. For a moment I thought he found me. If he did, he let his gaze pass over me the way one passes a window on a moving train, catching a shape that could be anything, choosing to let it be nothing. I placed my empty glass on a tray that a server held level as a horizon. The ring on my finger was cool again. I kept my hands low at my sides, as if I were about to step on stage for a role that had already learned its lines. The house had stopped pretending to breathe. Now it listened. And from the furthest corner of the ballroom, where the mirrors double the world to make it feel abundant, I gave the night what it had asked for when it invited me back. I stayed very still. I let the silence do the speaking. I kept my eyes on the stage until the stage looked away first. Somewhere beyond the garden, thunder walked along the sky and did not yet raise its voice. The ballroom didn't break, it bent. Applause didn't return, only the slow scrape of chairs, the whisper of shoes. People spoke in half sentences, as if language might still negotiate with what they had seen. My father stood where the projector light had left him, washed pale, unmoving. Verena's hand hovered an inch from his sleeve, the same distance between confession and denial. I slipped toward the rear doors. The air outside the ballroom was cooler, the hum of music muffled by the walls. From here the night looked ordinary again, glass, marble, perfume, but the illusion had thinned. The chandelier's glow leaked through the archway like breath from a wounded animal. Inside, Verena began to speak. Her voice carried just far enough for me to hear the cadence, not the words. She was smoothing the surface, layering calm over panic, the way she always did. I leaned against the wall and let my eyes close for one heartbeat. The rhythm of the house had changed. It would never find its old tempo again. I remembered the day I left this place. A suitcase, a storm, the way my father refused to look up from his newspaper. Verena had said, "You'll regret walking away from stability." I had answered, "Not from silence." That memory returned now, complete, as if it had been waiting behind the wallpaper all this time. A figure approached Elise. Her eyes were rimmed red but dry. "What did you do?" she asked, voice thin. "Nothing new," I said. "I told the truth. You embarrassed him. I freed him from pretending." She shook her head, unsure whether to hate me or thank me. "Everything's ruined." "No," I said softly, "only exposed." She turned away before I could see which answer she chose. Back inside, a murmur rose. Phones kept vibrating like restless insects. Someone announced that the servers would bring dessert. Someone else suggested coffee. Politeness rallied for a final defense. I stepped through the doorway again unseen and watched the room perform its own survival. My father spoke with two board members near the stage. His gestures were controlled, his jaw set. Verena stayed close, whispering directions. For a brief second, their eyes met, hers sharp, his hollow, and I understood that whatever bond had kept them aligned was already calculating its exit. The pianist began to play again, slower now, the melody searching for ground. I moved along the edge of the room, past faces that refused to meet mine. The chandeliers above trembled slightly, scattering fractured light across my path. Each glint found the silver ring on my finger, the small circle of metal that had started all of this. Near the far wall, Julian blocked my way. His tie was gone, his confidence cracked at the edges. "Was this revenge?" he asked. "No," I said. "Revenge ends things, this only reveals them." He laughed once, short and sharp. You think you're better than us? I think I finally stopped needing to prove that I was. He opened his mouth again but found no words, only breath. I walked past him. At the exit, a waiter stood uncertainly with a tray of untouched champagne. I took one, raised it slightly toward the room, and whispered, "To endings." Then I left it on the marble ledge and turned toward the corridor. The hallway lights buzzed faintly. I followed them toward the garden doors. Outside, night pressed cool and quiet against the glass. My reflection met me there, a dark figure with steady eyes. I touched the ring once more. It was warm now, as if it remembered what it had done. Through the window, I saw my father sink into a chair, Verena speaking rapidly beside him. Elise held a phone, her hands shaking. Julian paced. The screen above the stage hung blank again, but the damage it had delivered still pulsed in the air like heat after lightning. I stepped outside. The garden smelled of rain, even though the sky hadn't broken yet. Crickets sang their indifferent song. The fountain whispered the same rhythm it had kept when I was a child. Back then, I believed wishes could live in water. Tonight, I knew better. Truth doesn't drown. It floats until someone looks down. Behind me, the doors opened for a moment, spilling laughter too bright to be real. The house was trying to resurrect itself. It would succeed for a while, houses like this always do, but every chandelier hums differently after the first crack. I walked down the stone steps, each one colder than the last. At the gate, the wind rose, carrying the faint echo of applause from a lifetime ago. I didn't turn around. The car I had rented waited at the curb, headlights soft against the dark. I opened the door, slid inside, and closed it gently. My phone buzzed once more, a single line of text from an unknown number. Received, confirmed. I smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough to taste relief. The city lights stretched ahead, and for the first time in years, the road felt like mine. As I drove away, the mansion shrank behind me until it became nothing but a glow in the rearview mirror, a lantern sinking into distance. The sky above it flickered with the promise of a storm that would arrive by morning. I whispered to no one, "Let it rain." And the night, kind for once, began to listen. The next morning's light didn't arrive gently. It came through the glass like a blade, sharp and cold, cutting the ballroom into pieces of pale reflection. I had been standing there longer than I realized, still in the same dress, barefoot now, the echo of music gone but the scent of perfume and lies still hanging in the air. Someone had left a single champagne flute on the table, half full. The bubbles had long since died. I watched one last fleck of gold drift upward and vanish. That was how it began, the sound of a party dying quietly, one reflection at a time. The staff moved carefully around the debris of celebration. Confetti in silver trails, smudged footprints on marble, napkins folded too neatly for the chaos that had unfolded hours before. From the terrace, I could hear faint voices, Elise crying, Verena whispering, Arthur pacing. Every syllable muted by the walls that had learned how to keep secrets. I should have left before dawn, but I wanted to see what silence looked like in daylight. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. From the mezzanine above the hall, I could see Verena on the phone. She stood by the window, her reflection overlapping with the garden outside, like two worlds pretending to share one body. Her voice, though low, carried fragments I could understand. Transfer, pause everything, until I say, they can't find it. Her tone was calm again, too calm. The kind of control that knows panic is only useful when hidden. Arthur came into view, still in last night's tuxedo, tie gone, collar undone. He looked at her not like a husband, but like a man studying an investment that had begun to fail. "This isn't over," he said. "It never is," she replied. They didn't see me standing there. From my angle, their reflections floated inside the glass behind them, two ghosts arguing inside their own portrait. The morning light fractured around them, and for a moment, I saw the cracks that had been invisible the night before. Verena put down her phone, exhaling sharply. "They'll trace the emails." Arthur shook his head. "Not if we handle it quickly." "How quickly?" He hesitated. The silence that followed was heavier than his voice could ever be. "By noon." Verena turned toward him, her calm beginning to crumble. "You're not making sense." He looked past her to the place where his reflection ended. "I'm making arrangements." That word, arrangements, used to mean family dinners and travel plans. Now it meant survival. I backed away before they noticed. My footsteps made no sound on the carpet. When I reached the end of the hallway, I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window. Outside, the sky was an innocent blue, too soft for what was about to happen. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the people who had received the files were already awake, reading through the evidence, deciding which headlines would be written first. The truth had left this house hours ago. I went downstairs. The staff avoided eye contact. Someone whispered my name but didn't finish the sentence. It was strange how quickly guilt spread through walls like perfume through cloth. Once it arrived, it owned everything. In the dining room, the remnants of the party looked like archaeology. A half-eaten cake, candles burned to nothing, a bouquet of lilies leaning over its own vase. The air smelled sweet and sour at once. I sat at the long table. My mother's seat used to be there once, at the far end near the window, where she could watch the garden while listening to my father talk about success. She never interrupted him. She just smiled softly, as if she already knew that success was always hungrier than love. Now her chair was empty and the garden had grown wild. A shadow crossed the doorway. Julian. He looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, the confidence stripped from his posture. "You're still here." "For a moment," I said. He rubbed his eyes. "They're saying the foundation account's frozen. Reporters called the house this morning. And Father told them it was a technical error." He laughed bitterly. "We're living inside a technical error, aren't we?" "Maybe," I said, "but at least now it's visible." Julian sat down across from me. For once he didn't look like a man rehearsing power. He looked like someone who had finally realized what it cost. "What happens now?" he asked. "What always happens," I said. "The truth grows teeth." He stared at me for a long time, then said quietly, "You knew this would happen." "Yes." "Did you plan all of it?" I met his eyes. "Not the lies, just the light." He didn't know how to answer that. None of them ever did. The clock on the wall ticked with deliberate cruelty. Every second stretched, louder, clearer. At 9:10, Verena entered the room. Her heels clicked across marble like punctuation marks. She didn't look at Julian. She looked only at me. "You think this is victory?" she said. "I think it's air," I replied. "Arthur will fix it. He's already broken." Her lip trembled for the first time since I'd known her. "You destroyed everything," I stood. "No, Verena, you did. I just turned on the light." Her breath caught. For a moment I thought she might slap me, but she didn't. She just stared, really stared, as if trying to memorize the face of the storm that had finally reached her door. Then she whispered, "You're just like her." "My mother?" Her nod was almost invisible. She wanted truth more than peace, and look where that got her. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, not from guilt, but recognition. "She died believing silence was love," I said. "I won't make that mistake." Verena's eyes hardened again. The softness retreated, the steel returned. "Get out of this house." "I was never in it," I said. As I walked past her, I heard her whisper something else, too low for words. Maybe it was prayer. Maybe it was calculation. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. At the doorway, I paused and looked back. The sunlight caught the chandelier again. For the first time, I noticed a single crystal missing near the center, a tiny absence in perfection. It dangled slightly, trembling. And in that tremor, I could almost hear it singing, "Every empire cracks from the inside first." I smiled, stepped into the hall, and let the sound of the house fade behind me. By late morning, the house had learned to whisper. Doors closed softer. Steps landed lighter. Even the staff breathed like they were trying not to crease the air. Somewhere on the second floor, a vacuum shut off mid-hum and never came back. The quiet wasn't peace. It was strategy. I went to the library because the room remembered how to hold silence without breaking it. Dark wood, tall shelves, a window that had always made a promise it never kept about sunlight. Dust floated in tiny, private galaxies. I could hear the garden faintly through the glass, the fountain counting without emotion. Arthur found me there. He did not knock. He never had. He walked the way a verdict enters a courtroom, as if the floor had signed a contract to carry him. "We are going to resolve this," he said. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't use my name. "Resolve," I repeated. Such a loyal word. He ignored it. "There will be statements, a temporary step back from public events. We will review internal protocols. People will be reassured." "People," I said. "Not victims, not donors. Not communities, people." He stepped closer. "I built something that feeds a city. I won't let carelessness starve it." "Carelessness," I said. "Is that what you're calling it?" His jaw worked. He looked past me toward the window into a light that did not reach him. "You always wanted to make things moral." "I wanted them to be clean." "Clean is an illusion." "No," I said. "Clean is what remains when the lies leave." He sighed, the sound a practiced instrument. "You never learned the cost of doing good. Perhaps because you never had to pay salaries or keep the lights on or answer a board that only understands graphs." "Graphs," I said softly, "do not prove goodness. They prove order. You love order because it lets you draw your borders with a ruler." He lifted his chin. "Enough," that word again. The word that had ended my arguments as a child and my meals and sometimes whole days. I let it pass through me like wind through a broken window and refused to be moved. "You're angry," I said. "But not at what was done. You're angry that it was seen." His mouth pressed into a straight line. For a moment I thought he would shout. He didn't. He did something worse. He smiled, thin, cold, institutional. "We are family," he said. "The way you handled this was disloyal." I laughed once quietly. "Family, the banner you raise when the law knocks." His eyes flashed. He came close enough for me to see the tired map of his skin, the places where years had folded and unfolded. "You think you've done something noble. You haven't. You embarrassed your name." "I removed my name from your costume," I said. He stared at me a long time. Then he said, almost gently, "You always were dramatic, and you always were careful." He turned away first, as he always did. At the door he paused without looking back. "Leave the house before lunch. It will be better for everyone." "The house," I said, "loves giving orders." But he was gone. I stayed in the library until the light shifted from white to the softer gold that books prefer. My phone lay quiet on the table beside me, screen dark, a sleeping witness. When it finally buzzed, the vibration was thin and firm, like a fingertip tapping a window. "Received. Under review." 2 minutes later, another message arrived. "Please provide a reachable number for follow-up. Anonymous status retained." I forwarded a number that wasn't mine, then set the phone face down and watched the ceiling until it blurred. I thought of my mother then, the way she would touch the spines of books as if greeting old friends. She would say, "Stories protect us from the parts of the world that forget to be kind." I wanted to believe it still. I wanted to believe it now. Footsteps again, softer this time. Verena. She didn't enter. She stood in the doorway the way someone stands on the shoreline, unwilling to commit to the water. "Arthur has a press call at noon," she said. "He will say as little as possible. It is always the wisest thing." "For the guilty," I said. "For the breathing," she replied. "You mistake oxygen for confession." I faced her fully. She looked immaculate again. New blouse, new calm. The kind of recovery that only money and discipline can purchase before lunch. But her eyes betrayed her. Red at the edges, a shine that wasn't glamour. "Do you want me to apologize?" I asked. "No," she said. "I want you to understand that truth without timing is theater." "Then call me an actress," I said. "I prefer that to accountant." A muscle in her cheek twitched. She stepped into the room at last, closed the door behind her and crossed to the window. For a long moment we stood side by side looking at our reflections superimposed on the garden. 2 women, one sharpened by exile, one polished by proximity. If I tilted my head just right, our faces nearly aligned. She spoke without turning. "When I met your father, I believed money could be taught to behave." "And did it?" I asked. "It learned to perform." She drew the curtain an inch and let it fall again. Then she finally looked at me. "I do not ask for forgiveness, I do not offer it, but there is something you should know. He is not the man you think he is." I stayed very still. "He is exactly the man I think he is." "No," she said. "He is worse and he is better. Both are true. He believes that if he keeps the machine running, the machine will justify itself." "And you?" "I believed that if I became the machine, I could steer it away from harm." "And where did you steer it?" She smiled without pleasure. "Toward survival. Survival is a poor compass. It points everywhere and nowhere." Her hands were empty. For the first time since I had known her, Verena stood without an accessory to hold the world together. She seemed lighter and older in the same breath. "There will be consequences," she said. "For me, for Elise, for Julian, maybe for him, and you will go on with your life and succeed at being honorable. I am not sure which of us is lucky." "I am," I said, "the one who can sleep." She nodded once, a bow to a reality that could not be negotiated. "Then sleep, but leave this house first." She left me the room and the silence and the dusty light. I sat until the messages on my phone multiplied. Requests for comment from numbers I did not recognize, a polite inquiry from a reporter I did, a calendar placeholder from an agency that chased controversies the way tourists chase vistas. I declined. The house hummed through the walls. Somewhere a tray was set down too hard, a glass was stacked too sharply, a voice was hushed with the speed of an apology. At 11:40, the sky changed. Clouds gathered from the direction of the river, shouldering each other into a heavy quilt. The sunlight dimmed as if someone had breathed on the glass. Wind folded itself against the windows. The first drop of rain hit like a small knuckle rapping politely. I left the library and went to the solarium where the house kept its pretend garden. The lemon trees had grown thin, their patience stretched by winters they hadn't evolved to survive. I touched a leaf with 2 fingers. It felt like paper and persistence. From here I could see the driveway. A black car idled beneath the portico. Another arrived, then a third, drivers with identical posture. The world was arriving to negotiate the ruin. News vans would come later, they always did. Julian crossed the gravel, phone to his ear, shoulders tight. Elise went the other way, back toward the house, carrying a box that looked too heavy for what it likely contained: photographs, small gifts, memories that had waited on shelves for years to be hurried into exile. Rain found its rhythm. Not a downpour yet, just the steady rehearsal of one. The sound softened the edges of the house. Everything looked honest in gray. I felt the storm reach something in me I had kept wrapped in old linens. A memory of another rain, another day, a bus station, a suitcase with a broken zipper, the relief of leaving and the terror of it sharing a single spoon. I remembered the ache in my legs from standing too long because I wouldn't sit beside the man who looked at me like a purchase, remembered counting the minutes until the bus came and then counting them again after it left. I put my palm flat to the glass. It was cool and smooth and unforgiving. My reflection leaned back toward me out of the storm. I could almost see the girl I had been standing beside the woman I had become. We shared the same eyes. We no longer shared the same hunger. Behind me, someone cleared his throat. Arthur. He did not enter the solarium. He stayed at the threshold as if there were a line on the floor he could not cross. I made my statement, he said. We will cooperate with any inquiry. Verena has stepped back temporarily. Elise and Julian will not be involved in operations. Temporary, I said. The word clung to the window and slid down with the rain. It will calm, he said. Everything calms. Except truth, I said. He watched the driveway where the cars waited like commas. You could have come to me. I did, I said, for 18 years. His shoulders sank, not with defeat but with a heaviness that finally admitted its own name. He took one step into the room and stopped again. What do you want, Ariella? The question was wrong. It assumed the world were available for trade. I turned from the storm and faced him fully. I want nothing, I said, and that is what you cannot forgive. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was something in his gaze I had seen only twice in my life. The night my mother died and the night I left. Not love, not even regret. A sudden and temporary capacity for silence to mean more than victory. You are my daughter, he said. I am a person, I answered. Whether or not you belong to that fact is your choice. He nodded as if a verdict had been delivered. Then he left me with the lemon trees and the rain and a room that did not care which of us was right. By afternoon, the storm arrived in full voice. The house trembled in its bones the way old structures do when the sky decides to test their memory. Power flickered, returned, flickered again. Somewhere a fuse surrendered and the chandelier lights dimmed to a honeyed hush. I walked the halls barefoot, the stone cool and grateful under my feet. When the first siren wailed in the distance, almost swallowed by thunder, I felt the plot of the day slide neatly into place. Not for the house. For me. The storm had finished a sentence I had begun years ago. I packed in 20 minutes. Not because I was in a hurry, because I owned almost nothing here. A dress folded into a suitcase. The ring stayed on my hand. The photo of my mother and me from the library went into the side pocket, not as proof of origin, but as permission to leave origin behind. On my way to the front door, I paused at the foot of the stairs. Verena stood halfway up, one hand on the rail, watching me with an expression I could not read. We looked at each other as the storm threw white veins across the sky. Will you come back? She asked. To this house, I said. No. She nodded once, slow. Then let me be practical one last time. Do not answer calls from anyone who says they want to help you manage your story. They will want to own it. I already do, I said. Something like pride softened her mouth, or surrender. Good, she said. Arthur never understood that stories are laws in homes like this. He only understood laws that wear suits. We stood in the thunder until the silence between us learned how to be kind. Then I opened the door and stepped into the rain. It hit my face with gladness. The gravel gave under my heels with a sound like paper tearing. The portico's stone was slick and honest. I lifted my face and let water erase the last of the night's perfume from my skin. Across the drive, a car door opened. The driver raised an umbrella and hurried toward me, but I waved him off and walked bareheaded to the car. Just before I reached it, I looked back. Arthur stood in the doorway, small against the dark wood, framed by a hallway that still believed it could explain itself. Verena was a shadow at his shoulder. Elise leaned against the banister, watching me leave the way people watch fire trucks pass, guilty for being grateful it is not their house this time. Julian kept pacing, the same route carved like a groove in a record. I lifted my hand, not a goodbye, a release. Then I got into the car and shut the door. The world softened to a quiet cave of rain on glass and the steady patience of an engine waiting for instruction. I gave the driver an address that was not home, not yet. A a temporary place with white walls and clean sheets and a window I could sit by while the storm wrote its music. We pulled away. The tires sent up small waves. The mansion receded, its edges smudged by weather. The lemon trees in the solarium blurred into a green memory. My phone buzzed once more in my palm. Proceeding, expect contact within 48 hours. You did the right thing. I wiped a line through the fog on the window with my knuckle and watched the road ahead sharpen. The storm did not slow us. It felt like an escort. By the time the city rose to meet us, the sky had thinned from charcoal to slate. Thunder walked away to test other roofs. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and let a calm I trusted fill the space behind my ribs. The house had cracked. That was no longer my business. What mattered was this: the girl at the bus station had finally reached the other side of the map. And the woman in the car had learned that leaving is not a single act but a discipline. You step away. You keep stepping. You do not look back when lightning offers you a mirror. At a red light, the driver glanced at me in the rear view. "Rough weather," he said. "Necessary," I answered. And when the light changed, the city opened its mouth and let me pass. The rain didn't end. It simply learned to whisper. By the time I reached the apartment I'd rented under another name, the city had folded the storm into its own noise, cars slicing through puddles, the deep-throated hum of a train passing somewhere underground. I peeled off the wet dress, left it over the back of a chair, and watched the water drip from the hem like exhausted applause. The apartment was small and anonymous. One room, a narrow balcony, a table that remembered being new. I made coffee that tasted like tin and leaned against the window, watching the gray dissolve into lighter gray. The phone on the table blinked twice, notifications from the world that had started turning without me. Headline: Paul Foundation under review for financial discrepancies. Subheader: Internal audit launched after anonymous source submits evidence of misused funds. I read the line twice, then let the phone fall face down. It wasn't satisfaction that came, it was gravity. Every truth drags weight behind it. By noon, the first calls arrived. A journalist from the Herald, then another from World Finance Weekly. I ignored them. I wasn't interested in telling the story, I had already lived it. Outside, the city kept moving as if nothing had changed. Buses, umbrellas, hands in pockets. The world rarely slows for revelation. At 2:00, the rain stopped. Light spilled into the apartment in uneven shards, glinting off the silver ring on my finger. I turned at once, feeling the faint click again, the secret mechanism built inside. It was simple, elegant, and ancient, a miniature flash drive embedded beneath the stone. Not by chance. I'd commissioned it years ago when the first doubts had started to grow roots. My mother used to say, "Always keep something the world can't see." I finally understood. I opened the laptop. The last file transfer from the night before blinked complete. Folder: the Paul Foundation /verification set, each document labeled, cross-checked, time-stamped. I scrolled through them in silence: emails, scanned receipts, account logs. It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about the empire they built from pretending goodness was a currency. A message popped up in the corner of the screen. Unknown contact, safe drop received, copies archived, investigation progressing. You did the right thing. I closed the laptop. The words "the right thing" felt like a bruise. By evening, I stepped out to the balcony. The air smelled of wet asphalt and citrus peel from the cafe downstairs. Across the street, a billboard displayed a charity ad, children smiling under the Paul Foundation logo. The image flickered once, then twice, before the rain returned. I could almost hear my father's voice behind that logo, practicing the speech he would give the board. "We are cooperating fully. This is a misunderstanding." Integrity remains our cornerstone. He would survive this storm, at least for a while. Men like him always do. They rebuild faster than the world forgets. I poured the rest of my coffee over the balcony railing, watching it vanish into the street. For a brief second, the scent reminded me of the ballroom, the warmth, the lights, the careful cruelty. And then it was gone. Inside, the TV murmured in the background. Breaking news. Verona's photo filled the screen, composed, immaculate, taken from a gala years ago. The anchor's voice was steady. Sources confirm that Verona Paul, co-director of the Paul Foundation, has resigned from all positions effective immediately. Investigations continue regarding the misallocation of charitable funds to private subsidiaries. No arrests have been made. Her resignation had come faster than expected. I wondered if she had done it out of fear or precision. Probably both. Verona never surrendered, she negotiated her defeats. I muted the television. The silence that followed was cleaner than any apology. As dusk settled, my phone vibrated again. Another message from an unknown number, this one shorter. He's looking for you. I didn't need to ask who he was. Arthur Paul was not a man who searched, he summoned. If he was looking, it meant the stage had changed. Somewhere, he had already planned how to reframe the story, how to turn exposure into martyrdom. The family has suffered enough. A rogue employee, a misunderstanding, the script wrote itself. But this time, I wasn't in his audience. I turned off the phone and stepped away from the table. The city's neon signs began to bleed across the wet glass of the window, pink and blue and gold, colors that belonged to no truth, only reflection. I thought about what Verena had said before I left. Truth without timing is theater. Maybe she was right, but theater at least makes people look. I poured a second cup of coffee, let it go cold in my hands, and whispered to no one, "Let them look." Outside, thunder rumbled again, faint but sure, as if the storm had circled back to make sure I was still listening. And I was, because beneath the cracks I could hear it, the house finally learning how to fall. By late afternoon, the city was murmuring about the Paul Foundation. News alerts pinged across screens, radios whispered their own versions of events, and social media carried fragments of evidence faster than anyone could verify. I watched from the small apartment window, the rain still tracing paths down the glass like silver veins. Arthur Paul appeared on a live interview, perfectly composed. His voice was steady, rehearsed. There has been a misunderstanding regarding internal accounts. The Foundation remains committed to its mission. We are fully cooperating with the investigation. Polite, controlled, just like the man who had raised me. He didn't mention names. He didn't acknowledge the files, the spreadsheets, the videos that had left the house hours before the storm. I sipped cold coffee. Every sip tasted like iron and satisfaction, not triumph, not revenge, just the pure quiet of the world finally noticing what it had ignored. My phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. The first inquiries are underway. Remain available but cautious. You acted precisely. I let it sit on the table, face down. These were not congratulations, they were confirmation. I had set the machinery in motion, now it would run without me. I walked to the balcony and let the damp air wash over my face. Somewhere in the city, news vans and journalists were gathering, waiting for another statement, another angle, another confession. None of them would find me. I had already left the narrative behind. Inside, the apartment felt impossibly still. I ran my fingers over the photo of my mother and me, pressed into the side pocket of my bag. It was a relic, but also a witness. A reminder that I had once been fragile and afraid. I had survived, and now the world had to adjust to what had been released. The sun broke through the clouds in a pale, reluctant glow. My reflection in the balcony glass caught the light. I could see her, the young girl I had been, standing beside the woman I had become. Both eyes watched the street below, both knowing the same truth. Control is an illusion, but clarity is not. I heard footsteps behind me. Elise and Julian had arrived, neither speaking first. Their faces carried the weight of those who have realized the game is larger than themselves and that no one wins alone. "I don't understand why you did it," Julian said finally. "Because it needed to be done," I replied. "Not for vengeance, not for pride, just so it couldn't be hidden anymore." Elise looked down at the balcony railing, her hands tight. "Mother, she misjudged the world," I said, "as did our father." Julian's jaw tightened. "Does father know? I don't think it matters anymore." The rain began to fall again, lightly at first, then stronger. The street below began to blur, colors melting into each other. It was as if the world itself had decided to cleanse what had been allowed to rot unseen. I let the storm embrace me, the cold droplets on my skin sharp and awakening. I didn't look back at the apartment behind me, at the mansion or the stage, or the empty ballroom where the truths had been revealed. Arthur Paul could handle the fallout. He always did. Verena would rebuild her carefully polished composure. Elise and Julian would learn lessons they were not ready to fully understand. And I would walk through the rain and the neon-lit streets, untouchable in a way the family I was born into could never comprehend. I smiled faintly. It was not a smile of triumph nor satisfaction. It was a smile of release. A recognition that the story was over, that the revelation had done its work, and that I was finally free from the weight of their empire. Somewhere above, the clouds split just enough for the sun to break through, scattering light across wet streets and dripping eaves. I inhaled and let the air fill me. The files, the messages, the storm, the city, they were all part of a world I had set in motion. A world that had learned that silence does not protect lies. And as I stepped into the waiting car, the engine warm beneath my hands, I whispered softly, "Truth doesn't need applause, it just needs light." The city blurred past. The mansion faded behind me. And for the first time, I felt the kind of calm that only comes after the storm has finished speaking. The storm had passed, leaving the streets slick and shining, but inside the Paul estate, a different kind of chaos brewed. By the time I returned for the scheduled board meeting, the mansion had become a house of whispers and shifting shadows. Arthur's office smelled of old leather and tension. Papers had been moved and replaced, phones left unanswered, the staff running silently in the corridors, each step calculated to avoid drawing attention. I stepped into the room without knocking. No one asked me to sit. I didn't. Standing near the window, I watched Arthur move around his desk, a man desperate to regain control over a world that had just shown its fragility. "You're here," he said, voice low, steady but strained. His eyes flicked briefly to the laptop at the edge of the table, where I had left a few files open, blurred enough to hide details, but enough to let him understand the size of the wave that had arrived without warning. "I am," I replied. Calm, measured, my own reflection standing tall behind my eyes. Verena stood near the far wall, arms folded, her face pale but composed. Elise and Julian lingered just beyond her, observing, careful not to be seen as participants, but unable to detach from the tremors that had reached every corner of their carefully curated lives. Arthur leaned over the desk, palms flat against the mahogany. "You don't understand what you've done. This could ruin everything." "I understand perfectly," I said. "Everything that was already broken is just showing itself now." His jaw clenched. "You're reckless." "I'm precise," I replied. "Every file, every message, every image, it's exactly where it needs to be. I didn't invent the cracks, I just revealed them." Verena's lips pressed together. Her eyes, usually so sharp, flickered with something I hadn't seen before, a trace of fear, subtle and fleeting. She spoke before Arthur could regain the floor. "Ariella, this isn't just about exposing mistakes. You've destabilized a system. There are consequences." "I know," I said softly, "and they'll find their own paths to those consequences. I've already done what I came to do." Arthur slammed a fist lightly on the desk, a noise meant to startle, meant to reclaim authority. It only echoed empty in the space between us. "You've humiliated this family, publicly. How do you think our partners will react?" "The media, the donors? I don't care about the image of the family," I interrupted. "I care about the truth." Silence settled in the room, the kind of silence that carries more weight than any argument. I watched Arthur's face shift, realizing that no amount of rehearsal could recover the control he thought he had. The house was not just silent, it was witnessing, and no one here could pretend otherwise. Verena stepped closer, her heels tapping softly on the hardwood floor. "He can still repair it," she said, her voice low. "If we manage the narrative carefully, if we craft the story." "You're already too late," I said. "The story isn't yours to craft anymore." Julian's voice broke the quiet. This isn't fair, you can't just—" "I can," I said sharply. "I've been left out of this house for years, for decades, and now I decide what is revealed." Elise's eyes welled with tears. "But the family," I said, "was never mine to protect, not from itself." Arthur leaned back in his chair, the veneer of confidence cracking. "Do you realize what you've done?" "Yes," I said, "and I am prepared for it." Verena's hands fell to her sides. She seemed to measure the room, to calculate the distance between authority and inevitability. Then she said quietly, "You've won in a way, but remember, storms leave debris. Not all of it is visible." I smiled faintly, the first real smile of the day. "Debris is only a problem if you stay behind it." Arthur's shoulders slumped slightly, though his face remained composed. He knew, even if he would not admit it aloud, that the walls he had built from money and control were collapsing, not because of others, but because the truth had found its voice. I turned toward the door. My briefcase was in my hand, the same one I had packed with files weeks ago in preparation for this day. Each document, each recording, each timestamp note was a small nail in the coffin of the illusion. Before I left, I placed my hand lightly on the desk, close enough to touch Arthur's papers but not move them. "I didn't destroy anything," I said. "I just let the light in." Verena met my eyes. "You're not afraid?" "I was once," I said. "Now I know the storm belongs to everyone, not just me." I walked out. The room stayed silent. The only sound was the faint tapping of the rain against the window, a soft reminder that storms do not need permission to arrive, and neither do truths. I stepped into the hallway, the echo of my heels on the polished marble like the final note of a symphony that had begun 10 years ago. Arthur remained behind the desk, Verena just beyond him, both staring after me as if I carried the storm in my hands. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fear. I could hear the muted voices of staff rearranging files, adjusting schedules, pretending that the world was still the same. But the cracks were visible now. Even the walls seemed to sigh under the weight of what had been revealed. Outside, the city waited. News vans were already parked along the street, engines running quietly, reporters reviewing notes. By the time the files reached their inboxes, the narrative would be unstoppable. I opened the balcony door and let the rain hit my face. Cold, sharp, cleansing. I could feel it through the sleeves of my coat, on my cheeks, in my hair. The storm mirrored the collapse inside the house. Each drop a tiny hammer against the illusion. Behind me, the voices of the family rose and fell. Arthur's calm, Verena's precision, Julian and Elise's uncertainty. They were reacting, not controlling. And that was the difference. I leaned against the railing, watching the water gather and flow over the stones below. I allowed myself a small smile. Not triumph, not cruelty, just recognition. The machinery they had built to control everything had failed because the foundation, truth, was stronger than fear. A message blinked on my phone, all files received. Investigation underway. You acted precisely. I placed the phone in my pocket. The judgment was no longer mine. It belonged to the world and to the storm. Lightning flashed in the distance. The mansion's silhouette seemed smaller, diminished, fragile against the gray sky. In a few hours, it would be in every newsroom, every discussion, every whisper about power, trust, and the illusion of control. I stepped back from the balcony, drying my face, and looked once more at the room I had left behind. The walls, the chandelier, the carefully arranged furniture, all symbols of an empire that believed it could contain the truth. But the truth had a way of bending even the strongest structures. I walked through the front doors, ignoring Arthur's attempt to call my name, Verena's last glance of warning. Elise and Julian lingered in the doorway, pale and uncertain. Their world was changing faster than they could calculate. The car waited at the curb, engine humming softly. I slid inside, shutting the door, and let the city carry me away. The mansion faded behind me, a golden memory crumbling under the weight of revelation. I exhaled, feeling the tension in my chest dissolve. I had not destroyed anyone. I had not humiliated anyone. I had only allowed the light to enter. And in that light, the cracks had finally become visible. Thunder rolled across the city as I drove. The streets reflected the storm, the neon signs bending in wet puddles, the rain tracing lines like punctuation. I whispered softly to no one, "This is the truth. Let it speak." Somewhere far above, the clouds began to break. Sunlight touched the wet streets briefly, a fleeting promise that everything, even the darkest revelations, eventually finds balance. And in the car, with the ring still on my finger and the storm echoing behind me, I felt the first real freedom I had known in years. The collapse was complete. The empire would rebuild, but it would never be the same, and I would not return. The next morning, the sky was soft, pale gold fading into blue. I sat on the balcony of my small apartment, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the city stretch and wake beneath the soft drizzle from the night before. Streetlights still gleamed in puddles, reflecting colors that seemed too honest for the chaos that had passed. The files I had sent the night before had already begun their work. Reports had been filed, investigations launched. Arthur's empire of appearances was exposed, and for the first time I understood the weight of truth in motion. It moved slow but unstoppable, creeping into the offices, emails, and calls that no one would see until it was too late. I reached for the photo I had tucked away in my bag, the one of my mother and me from years ago. Sunlight hit the glass, catching her hair in a way that made her look alive and eternal. I traced her face with a finger, feeling the memory pulse beneath the glass. She had taught me more about courage and silence than anyone else ever could. A knock at the door pulled me from thought. I wasn't expecting anyone. I ignored it at first, letting the sound echo in the empty apartment. Then another knock, firmer, more insistent. I placed the photo on the table and walked over. A courier stood there, hands gloved, face unreadable. In his hand, a plain envelope sealed with no wax, no mark of return. I took it, thanked him, and closed the door. Back at the table, I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. I read it slowly. Some truths destroy what should have died long ago and set the living free. No signature, no explanation, just the clarity I had been waiting for. I folded it back and placed it next to my mother's photo. I poured another cup of coffee and sat quietly, listening to the hum of the city below. Cars passing, distant voices, the faint sound of construction. Life carried on, unaware, and yet irrevocably changed. The sun rose higher, spilling light across the floor. I leaned back in my chair and let the warmth touch my face. For the first time in years, I did not feel the weight of expectation pressing on my shoulders. The mansion, the family, the empire, they all existed, but none of them held power over me anymore. Messages began to arrive on my phone, inquiries, updates, confirmations. I read them without urgency. Each one confirmed the path had begun. My work was done. The rest belonged to the world. I glanced at the photo of my mother again. She had believed in subtle truths, in courage whispered between lines. I understood now that my strength had come from her, and from the years I had spent learning to stand alone. Outside, the sky deepened into gold and soft lavender. A breeze carried the scent of rain and the faint aroma of blooming flowers from a nearby park. I inhaled, feeling the air fill me like something I hadn't known I'd been missing. I picked up a pen and opened a notebook I had kept tucked away. The pages were blank, waiting. I wrote slowly, deliberately. Forgiveness isn't what they deserve. It's what I needed to breathe again. I folded the notebook closed and set it beside the photo and letter. The apartment was quiet, except for the city and the memory of the storm. I leaned back, eyes closed, feeling the first real calm settle into my chest. Somewhere, beyond the glass and stone and distance, Arthur would rebuild. Verena would recover. Elise and Julian would navigate the wreckage. But I would walk forward, unbound, free to chart a life measured by truth rather than expectation. The sun touched my face again. I opened my eyes, and for the first time I was completely at peace. Evening arrived gently, as if the city itself were honoring the end of the storm. I remained on the balcony, watching the fading light stretch over rooftops, the streets slick and shiny from rain that had washed away the night's tension. Everything looked ordinary, but I knew the world had shifted subtly, irreversibly. I opened my laptop for the first time since the morning. Reports and updates scrolled across the screen. Investigators had begun piecing together the files, tracing every irregularity back to its source. Emails, transfers, receipts, they were no longer abstract shadows on a screen. They had become proof. And though I had set it all in motion, I let the world take its own pace in reacting. That was not my concern anymore. On the balcony beside me, the notebook lay closed. I had written my thoughts carefully, but I knew I didn't need words to complete the story. I had acted. Now I simply existed outside the chaos I had revealed. A soft knock at the door startled me. I turned. No one was there. Only the wind carried a faint rustle, brushing the curtains like a reminder. In that stillness, I realized the freedom I had fought for was not about others acknowledging it, it was about my own recognition of it. I walked over to the table and touched the photo of my mother. The memory was sharp and comforting. Her wisdom had always been quiet, layered between moments of tenderness and absence. I closed my eyes and breathed in the sense of lineage, of survival, of clarity. Everything I was had been forged in those quiet lessons, in the spaces where no one noticed. The city lights flickered on as twilight deepened. Traffic hummed below, lights reflected on wet streets, people moving unaware. I smiled faintly, not at them but at the contrast. Life had continued as usual while the foundations of an empire had begun to crumble. And I was outside it all untouched. I thought briefly of the family. Arthur, always meticulous, Verena, always poised, Elise and Julian, always rehearsed. They would react, they would strategize, they would rebuild. But I would not be present. I did not belong to their stage anymore. I had stepped out of the play before the curtain fell completely. The wind shifted and a paper slipped from the balcony ledge, a note I hadn't seen until that moment. Picking it up, I read, "The story is yours to carry. The world will hear it in time. Walk lightly, for truth can travel faster than the storm." I folded it carefully and placed it next to my mother's photo. The evening air smelled of wet asphalt and faint jasmine, a combination both sharp and familiar. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs, anchoring me to this moment. The balcony lights flickered on. The room behind me remained quiet, still, awaiting my next step. I glanced at the silver ring on my finger. Its surface gleamed in the twilight. I turned it slowly, feeling its weight, the quiet promise it had always carried. I sat back in my chair, legs crossed, hands wrapped around the now-cold coffee cup. Outside, the sky deepened into shades of rose and lavender. The city carried on, unaware of the truth it had just witnessed indirectly, and the rain left faint traces along the streets. For the first time in years, I felt the complete absence of obligation, the liberation from expectation. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, steady and composed. The girl I had been, frightened and uncertain, had merged seamlessly with the woman I had become, resilient, decisive, unbound. I opened the notebook once more and wrote a final line. Some things end quietly. But endings are doors opening the other way. I set the pen down. The sky faded to deep blue, city lights sparkling like scattered stars. The apartment was silent, the storm outside finished, the story concluded. I rose and stepped toward the balcony, railing one last time. The cool evening air brushed against my skin. I inhaled fully, tasting freedom. I whispered softly, "The light has arrived." And with that, I turned away from the window, closing the door gently behind me. The apartment, the city, the empire I had exposed, all remained in their own worlds. I had claimed mine. The night carried on. I walked into it without fear. The storm was behind me. The story was complete.